much. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation to come. It's my first time in South America. Many things are very similar, things are rather different, so it's quite an experience. Okay, so the talk's entitled Proof-THEORETIC Validity, and I want to try and examine this concept and see some of its advantages and some of its limitations. And what I'm going to start with is thinking a bit about analyticity, and in particular ask this question: could analytic statements actually be false? And I think there are three senses in which analytic statements could in fact be false. The first one, well, I want to get the first two out of the way, of course. The first one is simply that there are, of course, statements that are analytically false. Some evidence are false because they're false analytically, as a matter of their meaning. There's another sense in which you might think that analytic statements could be false. They're true, and they're necessarily true, but many necessary truths might be false, unless one adopts, the full principle or something like that. There are modal logics in which the necessities are contingent. So there's that sense in which if you adopted a certain theory of necessity, then analytic statements can be false. But actually, I think there's a third way in which analytic statements can be false. And the central example I'm going to take here is the liar sentence. Prima facie, the liar sentence says of itself that it's not true, and in fact, that's true. As a matter of its meaning, the liar statement is in fact true. It's true in virtue of its meaning. But of course, we're also committed to the fact that a statement that says something is true and another statement that says that it's not true can't both be true. They're contradictory. We're committed to the principle that contradictory statements can't both be true. So in fact, the liar statement is also not true. It's false. But it's false as a matter of meaning. Some people attribute this view to Tarski. I think this idea goes at least back to Charles Chihara in the 1980s. And then it was taken up by a number of authors recently as an interpretation of Tarski on semantic paradox, and also they've then developed it as their own view. The idea being that natural language is in itself inconsistent. It could be by virtue of containing predicates like true. That might at first seem strange. You think, well, how can a language be inconsistent? Isn't it theories that are inconsistent? But the point is that Tarski explicitly says that he's dealing with interpreted languages, as I put in the quotation at the end of it. He's not interested in formal language in the sense of uninterpreted languages. He's interested in interpreted languages, and in that sense, as an interpreted language, natural languages, he claims, are inconsistent. So, he's claiming that the lambda, this sentence is not true, is true as a matter of its meaning, and also not true as a matter of its meaning, and hence natural languages are inconsistent. They make inconsistent demands, but they make inconsistent demands as part of the meaning of the word true and the other apparatus of self-reference, the semantic closure. So analytic statements not only can be false, they actually are false. It seems to me that Paul Boghossian made a useful distinction some years ago now, back in the 90s, and he's been developing it ever since then. The view I'm adopting is inspired by Boghossian. It's not actually, I think, the view that Boghossian holds. But he's distinguishing epistemic analyticity from metaphysical analyticity. He thinks that, if I get him right, the metaphysical analyticity was undermined by Quine's arguments, but the epistemic analyticity is not undermined by Quine's arguments, and that, in fact, it's a respectable notion whereby someone can be committed by virtue of adopting certain concepts to a justified belief in the truth of certain statements. And that's where I part company from. He thinks it's a justified belief in the truth of those statements. I think it's a justified belief in those statements, but as may be clear from what I've just been saying about the liar, that belief might in fact be mistaken. Even though it's justified, it's a mistaken belief in the truth of those statements. The authors who've been developing these ideas about semantic paradox over the last 10 years, Joe Giuzzulli, Doug Patterson, have gone for some sort of trivialism or inconsistency theory. Matthew Eklund and Kevin Sharp have taken what seems to be a more reasonable line, saying, which perhaps is again not that dissimilar from Tarski's own line, that although the natural language concepts are inconsistent, that means that they need to be revised in some way in order to deal with semantic notions properly. One of the examples that Kevin Sharp reminds us of here is one that goes back to Dummett. I was wondering, looking at this, I was wondering whether we should now call this the B word, because I know a number of Americans find it very uncomfortable class of the N word, at least in public. Maybe we ought to be uncomfortable about using the word. We ought to be uncomfortable about mentioning the word Bosch. We should be very uncomfortable about using the word Bosch, but we should maybe be uncomfortable about mentioning the word Bosch. This is an example that Dummett has. I'm not sure that this is really quite a rather oversimplistic view of actually how Bosch works. But his idea is that simply being German warrants a person in being described as Bosch, but being described as Bosch also warrants the inference that they're barbaric in some way, from which you easily infer that all Germans are barbaric. Right? So simply embracing that concept, including that word in one's vocabulary, commits one to the analytic falsehood that Germans are barbaric. It's analytic because it simply follows from the meaning encapsulated in that term, but of course it's false. I thought it might be worth briefly saying that this is not meant to be a dialectic view. It's in fact almost the converse of the dialectic view. The dialectic view, or at least a dialectic view, would be to say that these concepts do commit one to the truth of these statements, maybe the truth and falsity of these statements. Yes, but then they take that as a modus ponens. Here we're taking this as a modus tollens, that in fact that's not how we should proceed. We should actually get rid of concepts, revise concepts that have consequences. And that's what Tarski says there in that final quotation. Tarski's response was to abandon the language of everyday life and restrict himself entirely to formalised language. Well, I'm not going to go that far, but that's very different from the dialectic view. So this talk, although it might seem otherwise at the moment, this talk is not about semantic paradoxes and about the liar, but just to close that introduction, there are at least the following positions that one could take about the liar. There's the position of Eklund and the others, the inconsistentists, who think that these concepts are inconsistent and either should be, that inconsistency should be dealt with in whatever way it does. That would be dialectists who think that the concept is inconsistent and in fact we have to accept that. And my own view, which I'll be talking about at the History of Maths conference next week, that actually all this theorising about inconsistency is mistaken based upon false understanding. What I want to do now with that in the background as an idea that simply by embracing a certain concept, including a certain term in one's vocabulary, one might find oneself committed to things that are in fact false, things that one wouldn't want to be committed to. So I'm going to come on down to think about the analytic consequences of including various terms in one's language, such as and, or, and if, not, and how that comes out as an analytic consequence. Okay, so second section, analytic validity. This is a term that goes back to Arthur Prior. There may be one or two people in the room who have not yet come across Tonk, but now's your chance to hear about Tonk all over again, 50 years on, still alive and, well, a little bit as well. It's certainly there everywhere. Prior was faced with a number of people, Popper and Neal are the obvious examples, who were suggesting that simply adopting certain linguistic rules, certain logical rules in one's language would commit you to a certain consequences. Simply adopting rules would make them right in their own, by fear. And he said, well, that's rubbish. That view. Look at Tonk, for example. Supposing I add the term Tonk to my vocabulary, I give it the following introduction to elimination rules. We might infer alpha Tonk beta for alpha, we might infer beta for alpha Tonk beta, an elimination rule. Then look, I can just chain a couple of an introduction rule and an elimination rule together, and I can derive any statement from any other. How can I possibly simply by adding a term and a couple of rules in my vocabulary make it the case that any statement follows from any other? That's an absurd. Well, I mean, in a sense, as he's put it, I agree that's an absurd view, but I don't think that's the right view of analytic validity. That's not what people had in mind. Maybe Popper and Neal were, slightly careless in the way they expressed this, but I want to mention a number of other authors who have a rather more subtle account of what it means to add a term to the vocabulary and then introduce rules for the manipulation of that vocabulary and thereby set up certain consequences. In a way, I mean, in a way, even then, in a way, that's right. It's just that the more at the end of the talk is going to be, if you don't like Bosch, don't use it in your vocabulary. If you don't like Tonk, don't use it in vocabulary. But if you do, you're in a mess. Committing to things that are false and mistake. So, what comes out of that then is to say, oh well, what's the more subtle account of analytic validity which does make sense in this, which is not subject to the sort that Prior made on it. What constraints must rule satisfy to give a coherent meaning which is then going to feed through to analytic consequences? Well, many of you will be aware that Michael Dummett introduced the term harmony back in the 1970s as a catch-all for whatever this constraint was going to be, and since then there have been a lot of proposals as to how this notion of harmony should be spelled out. As Dummett puts it, Prior was glossing over an absolutely crucial distinction. That's the distinction between, as he puts it, between two aspects of the use of an expression. And there needs to be harmony between these two aspects. There's the side of the rules for the use of the expression, which are, on what grounds can you make an assertion on that form? What do you need in order to assert something? And then, how is that linked to having made an assertion on that form? What consequences are you allowed to draw from that? In the case of Tonk, and in the case of Bosch, what we find is that they don't satisfy plausible constraints of harmony between these two aspects of the use of expression. In fact, the grandfather of all this, I think it's probably the right term for it, is Gerhard Gentzen back in the 1930s, who really had encapsulated this idea right back in his famous article on investigation of logical reduction, when he says that elimination inferences are, through certain conditions, unique consequences of the respective introduction inferences. That's the line, the Gentzen-inspired line that I want to take, rather than the way in which Dummett articulated. Actually, Dummett, as I say there, had loftier ambitions than I have today, and I think than Gentzen and others. He actually wanted to have an idea of the proof-theoretic justification of logical laws, that just in themselves, they would make them right. As I've said, as I put this on the table from the beginning, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you find yourself committed to false, if that's the right word for it, or invalid entailments. Dummett idea is that if you get this right, you'll always end up with analytically valid consequences being really valid. I don't think that's right. The paper that lies in the background to this talk then tries to spell out in quite some detail the way in which this proof-theoretic justification goes. There isn't time to go into that today, but basically what Dummett describes here are three grades of proof-theoretic justification. The first grade is simply being a derived proof. The second grade is what would actually be called an admissible rule. And the third grade then comes in as a consequence when you've actually got open assumptions and open variables in your proof. And many of the considerations in the second grade about admissibility don't apply when you've got open assumptions and free variables. Where you find this is in this book, The Logical Basis of Metaphysics, Dummett, which goes, although it was published in 1991, it was actually given to William James lectures in 1976. And what immediately inspired Dummett at that point were a series of articles by Dag Prawitz in the early 1970s. And that's what I'm drawing on a lot of the time here, these ideas of Prawitz's, which in themselves, by taking Prawitz to be the father, Gentzen to be the grandfather of this particular endeavour. So, the idea is we take the introduction rules as given, as saying what the grounds are that warrant the assertion of a certain sort of statement involving this term that facts. And then the elimination rule, that is, the rule that tells you what you're allowed to infer from any such statement, has to be related to that introduction rule, that set of introduction rules, in an appropriately harmonious way. And it's going to go in two directions. There's going to be what Prawitz would call a certain justifying operation, which then will apply to the introduction and elimination rules together in order to clarify this. What I'll be looking at is the inverse operation now, which somehow draws out the elimination rule from that introduction rule that's warranted. There's a famous quote from Prawitz. The main idea is this: one introduction inferences represent the form of proofs of compound formulas by the very meaning of the logical constants, and hence observability. Other inferences have to be justified by the evidence of operations of a certain kind. So these justified operations, what Prawitz concentrated on, are the same with the constants of the third grade, just as I said that briefly, is that you then have to take account of open proofs in this time to time. The idea you've got that argument schema rather than just an argument will have to be dealt with. So let's get some examples here to give some content to this. So here's an example of implication, a standard implication introduction rule here that you can insert A arrow B when you've got a derivation of B from A, and at that point you can discharge zero or more occurrences of A proof. Now at the first stage, at the first grade of consent justification, there will be consequences of that in terms of the derived inferences, which you can get simply using introduction. But A and B in themselves may have arrows in them. In particular, A may have arrows in it. So you need to somehow be able to draw inferences from arrow formulae as well. That's where the second grade comes in, and you have to think what inferences are admissible. So the crucial step now is to identify the arrow elimination rule that's justified by the second and third grade interpretation. And here's the way in which I'm setting that out, is that what we're saying is that the grounds for asserting A arrow B are that you've got a derivation of B from A. So let's assume that you can derive C from the assumption that there's a derivation of B from A. Then the rule says that you can derive C from A arrow B anyway, since that's in a sense going proxy for that derivation of B from A. So the general form of the derivation rule is going to, for arrow, for implication, is going to look like this. And then all the rules are roughly going to have this sort of shape, that if we assume that we can derive C from the grounds for asserting A arrow B, then we can derive C from A arrow B. So, now in order to get into Prawitz's justified operation, we have to make what Dummett misleadingly calls the fundamental assumption. The fundamental assumption is that when you've got an assertion in this example of A arrow B, there's a proof of A arrow B in which the final step is our introduction rule. See that on the next slide. He calls that a fundamental assumption. It's actually not an assumption, it's a lever that Prawitz actually proves in the course of his discussion of these things. It doesn't always work, it's not always the case. In particular, if you think about an open proof, it's almost invariably never the case in an open proof that the final step is going to be an introduction. It can easily be an elimination or for some other collective law. Okay, so if we make the fundamental assumption, then we have this shape. We've got our derivation of C from an assumption that there's a derivation of B from A. And we've actually got a derivation of B from A, which we needed in order to assert A arrow B in the first place. And what Prawitz is saying is that this is fundamentally a detour through A arrow B, which doesn't actually do any work in this derivation, because we can simply replace this assumed derivation of B from A by an actual derivation of B from A and simplify the whole proof. So the idea is that the shape of the elimination rule should be such that when it's placed into this kind of format where we just immediately arrive at the major premise by an introduction rule, we should be able to simplify things and show that we can go straight through it. Nothing more has been added at this point. Okay, well that may look an unusual elimination, it may not be the one that we're used to, but in fact we can pull out the more familiar modus ponendo ponens elimination rule for arrow from it. What we have in this shape is what I'm going to, I think goes back to Schroeder-Heisenberg in this terminology I was talking pretty lot about this. This is a higher level rule because instead of just a formula being assumed in the proof, we're actually assuming the existence of a derivation in the proof. So in that sense, this is a lower level rule, this is a higher level rule. And what we're going to do now is we're going to find a way to convert the higher level elimination rule into a lower level elimination rule where the only assumption is the assumption of formula. The idea being that if this is the case, we're assuming you've got a derivation of B from A, then if we actually had a derivation of A, we could help ourselves to B by that assumption that there's a derivation of B from A. And then we're assuming we can derive C from that, and so we can derive C from A arrow B itself. So the idea is that this little schema here is playing the same role as this higher level scheme. And then even this is perhaps not completely familiar, but again, other things being equal, which they aren't always, there might be some problematic assumptions of discharge and free variables and so on going on here. But in general, we commute the derivation of C from B with the inference that we have on the surface panel. I'll come back to the problems with the flattening procedure, which I'll mention in a moment. Okay, another example of conjunction. Here's the rule spelling out when one's justified in asserting a conjunctive statement. We apply the same procedure that if we can derive C from what we must have had, we must have had A in order to assert A arrow B. If we derive C from that, then we can clearly derive C from A and B. And similarly, if we can derive C from the other thing that we need to have in order to assert A and B, then we can derive C from A and B. Yeah, these two, as we sometimes called general elimination. In fact, we can reduce again the general elimination rules to the more familiar simplification rules simply by taking C to the A in one case and B in the other. And then conversely, we can derive the more general rule. The more general rule is if you can derive C from A, you can derive C from A and B. Well, simplification either says you can derive A from A and B, and we've got a derivation of C from that, so we've got a derivation of C from A. So the rules are clear. This flattening procedure is problematic, not for arrow, but for other connectors. There's actually a potential loss when one's flattening the rule in this way. It's actually an idea that I think was first proposed by a colleague of mine at St Andrews called Dikov, who've since disowned it. So there was a time it was called decoffization, but that was clearly an insult to Roy, who wanted nothing to do with this rule, even though he was the first to propose it. But it has been taken up by quite a lot of other authors, Sarah Negri and students of mine over here, and Connie Sterling, Peter Mill, all are employing this flattening form. Actually, this is another paper I've written the flattening procedure depends crucially on when I say arrow, I don't mean this arrow. The invertibility in classical sequence calculus of the arrow left rule is crucial to the flattened rule being as strong as the high level rule. And of course, in weaker logic, such as intuitionist logic, the arrow left rule is not reversible. In fact, you discover that there is actually loss of provability when you take this flattening procedure, which I think is quite right. Okay, so again, I should give acknowledgement here. The word general elimination harmony, which I've taken up, I think was first proposed by Roy Dikov together with a co-author of his, St Francis, who talk about this general procedure for deriving the elimination rules of the introduction, just looking at the inverse of Prawitz's justification operation. And what we need to do is to now just try and generalize this in order to see how it works. In the general case, we can see a couple of examples. So we're going to take a case where we've got a set of introduction rules, and we take all, for example, we've got 2 introduction rules for all. So in general, there may be a number, I think it would be n introduction rules. It may even be 0, as in the case of absurdity. There's a collection of introduction rules. Then what we want to do is to generate what may possibly be a collection of elimination rules, which are appropriately harmoniously justified by that collection of introduction rules. And then we're going to employ fundamental assumptions, so-called procedure we've seen, the Prawitz procedure, to show that interpretation. So here's the most technical slide, I think, in this talk, in the second one. We assume we've got n introduction rules, each of which has got ni premises. So there could be 0 rules, and there could be a rule which has 0 premises, or there can be 2 rules, each of which has got 1 premise, like or introduction, the general case. And then what we're going to do is we're going to thereby justify this product number of elimination rules of this shape. So we'll have a major premise, the main connected the constant in question, and we have a number of minor premises where we draw a conclusion C from some of the grounds that lie back there in the introduction rule, and then we can discharge those assumptions, which may be formally or may be derivations. They're formally in the case of our introduction and introduction. They're derivations in the case of our introduction, implication introduction. And then the idea here is that providing in the case of each of these elimination rules, it has a minor premise containing one of the grounds for each of the introduction rules. Then whatever introduction rule you took to justify Col A, which in this case is the ith introduction rule, you look along here to find the ith minor premise, which has its assumption one of the grounds for asserting the connection in question, and then you can pair off that ground there with the ground that's been chosen here, and there it is. We've got alpha ji, which is sitting up above pi ji here, and we pair it off with beta I here, and we can simplify in the standard. Okay, well that shows that the elimination rule is no stronger than the introduction rule warrants. We also need to be sure here, we're not quite so worrying, but what we want here, we want the introduction rules to give us all and only what the introduction rule. We've just shown it shows only. We've also got to show that it's strong enough that it shows all. Nothing doesn't generate more than the introduction rule warrants, but it doesn't generate less. That's a concept we call stability back in Logical Basis of Metaphysics. There are some articles by Davis and Fenning in which they discuss these matters. Harmony is called by them local soundness, stability is called by them local completeness. But I think we can avail ourselves of their test for local completeness to show that the general procedure I've just shown is in fact locally complete or stable. So here's the idea they've got is that rather than simplify and reduce, as in the Prawitz justifying procedure, we expand and show that we can always relate to it. So if, for example, we've employed the elimination rule to draw information out of a certain expression, alpha and beta in this case, we can always get back to where we were. So that the elimination rule hasn't lost information. We've still got enough information after applying the elimination rule to get back. So the elimination rule gives us all as well as only. It's worth, I think, to see the general case in the next slide, seeing how it works when we've actually got the general elimination rules. It actually rather kind of inverts things. So what we're doing is, here we're doing a couple of elimination steps, right? But to make sure that we can get alpha and beta out of alpha and beta, having performed those elimination steps, we've got an introduction rule to get this term. So the crucial thing is that having deployed these elimination rules to get C, we want to be sure that C is indeed what the introduction rule warrants. So that generalizes this repetitive where we've got a series of eliminations, but the introduction rule ensures that we get back to Here's the crucial example. This is why I'm interested in this, is Boolean negation. Just to put my cards on the table. I, for some years, as some of you know, have been committed to rejecting classical logic and embracing a weaker logic, relevance logic. But if you add Boolean negation to relevance logic, the whole thing collapses. You end up back in classical logic. So, what's wrong with Boolean negation? Well, simple story, it commits you to analytic falsehoods. That's why I'm interested in Boolean negation. As I mentioned just now, often Boolean negation is treated by having no introduction rule and this elimination rule. But I'm going to treat it as a primitive day, as indeed Gentzen did in a recently discussed manuscript of his PhD thesis. And the rule that he takes as the introduction rule, he calls it rule R, is this one, reductive form reductive absurdum. So what might be interesting is to apply the procedure we've just looked at, the general procedure, to see what elimination rules are justified by that introduction rule. While there's one introduction rule with two premises, so we get two elimination rules, each of which is drawing C from one of the grounds for asserting not A in the first place. We flatten these derivations in the way we've just been looking at, and then we invert the new derivation of C from B with the rule, and we end up with these two schemes, and then we recognise that this scheme is just a special case of that one, and so we basically ended up with X file limit. So simply adopting this form of reductive absurdum, we are promptly committed to X file limit for elimination rule, which I believe to be an analytic falsehood, an analytically invalid. Okay, so that's by way of the general prospectus. Where are we? Well, where we are is that we've apparently provided the proof-theoretic justification for basically classical logic. We've shown the analytic validity of our introduction, not introduction, reduction absurdum, simply by making that the introduction rule, and we've shown the analytic validity of bonus opponent, limit by justifying them by the Prawitz procedure. And that means that as the derived inferences, proof-theoretic justification of first grade, we're committed to positive and negative paradox. And I don't like it. And neither did Phil and Ackerman and other people. So we're talking ancestry here, and again Ackerman I think is the grandfather of relevant logic, and providing inspiration for the fathers of relevant logic, and as we found out, that way back in 1956, Ackerman wrote, one would reject the validity of the formula A arrow B arrow A, since permits the inference from A of B arrow A, since the truth of A has nothing to do with the lower connection models. And I happen also to believe Scott's had reason on all occasions why I think it starts happening. So where's the mistake? Well, some people think there's nothing wrong in itself with material implication. That's just justified by the rule that you've got for it. It's true analytically of arrow or not. What it's false of are the natural language counterparts. It's false of if not, they inappropriately model the natural language behaviour. Since, for example, there are false implications with false antecedent and false implications with true constant. I don't think that's right. First of all, just looking at negation, we've seen that justification validates X file the limit. but adding x passed on the limit to one's calculus produces non-conservative extensions and inferences in other connectives. But in fact, I think what's going on there is that we're simply taking far too strong a statement here. We're modelling not A as if A, then everything is true. Well, of course, if you endorse if A, then everything is true, and you endorse A, then it pushes to everything. Yes, I'm not going to dispute that. But that's not the right account of negation. The right account of negation requires a different introduction. So I'm getting to the end of my time. So the discussion here is basically about there being one logic which we're trying to get at. I don't want to embrace a plurality of logic, some of which are suitable for these purposes. With one logic, we find out what it is. We then adopt the right account of when you can assert statements in that logic, the right introduction rules, and that will then tell you what the right elimination rules is, and you then have a theorem logic. You get it wrong. It's very easy to come up with false theories in logic as in any other science. So, in relevance logic and in related investigation, substructural logic, and theories of linear logic, a lot of work's gone into developing more subtle accounts of the structure of proofs, which will require different ways of combining premises, in particular two different ways of combining premises. I'm not going to spell out the details here today, but the moral is that when you get it right, what you'll have will not only be analytically valid, that is, you're committed to it and you have a justified belief in it in virtue of the very meaning of connected rules, but it will actually be valid too. You'll actually got it right. You'll have the right theory. So, conclusion, nice quote from Prawitz about analytic. An argument is built out of other arguments or argument schemata is thus valid by the very meaning of the logical constants, is valid by definition, so to speak, but analytic truth and doesn't guarantee truth and validity. Classic example is Kasky liar. Another one is prior Tonk. But when the rules are in harmony, you can actually see you can see clearly what meaning has been encapsulated in the introduction rule. The elimination rule is then justified by the procedure we've seen. What's good about that is that we can now see more clearly how the meaning of the terms encapsulated in the rules feeds through to one's justified belief in the inferences that are then available. What's bad is to infer that however you do that, whatever logic you've got, classical logic, linear logic, relevant logic, intuitionistic logic, that somehow all those logics are good. All of them deliver valid moves. Some are valid, some are not. And you've actually got to make sure that you get the right rules in the first place so that you don't end up with invalid. And finally, there's some references in case